Morning, good afternoon. Wherever everyone is, my name is Ndindi Kitonga. I have a few remarks, and I actually look forward more to the conversation and less about what I'm going to share today. And so in Fanon's decisive letter of resignation as head of the Blida Joinville Hospital in Algeria, he writes, "The decision I have reached is that I cannot continue to bear responsibility at no matter what cost, on the false pretext that there is nothing else to be done." The last few months in Los Angeles, where I reside, have been marred by ICE brutally occupying the county, abducting people at their jobs, homes, and streets. This is happening in many cities across the United States. The people are fighting back with solidarity and with open revolt. Ours is a county of 10 million people. A third of us are foreign-born. 10% of us are undocumented, with nearly 1 out of 5 county residents either being undocumented themselves or living with an undocumented family member. Rapid response networks that patrol communities and warn folks of impending ICE operations are growing. People are supporting each other with legal and court support, hiding employees, fundraising for those affected, and looking out for their kidnapped loved ones when they are in detention. My local frutero was picked up in late June. All that was left was his empty fruit stand, half-cut watermelon slices spoiling and dripping in the summer heat. His name is Juan. We have since returned his empty fruit cart to his family. He remains in detention awaiting a legal process that we consider illegitimate. We cannot underscore the trauma recent ICE kidnappings and open-air assaults have on individuals and whole communities. Fanon's analysis is relevant to understanding capitalist colonial structures of the day, from Israel's genocide on Gaza to the racist abductions of racialized people in the United States, the expansion of carceral and surveillance state through an unholy marriage of public and corporate interests, and the violence of all borders. For Fanon, the colonial condition is an enduring, persistent state of trauma, not just a series of traumatic events, a miasmic slog of everyday mundane violence producing a collective trauma. And here I don't want to suggest that we develop a callousness or ambivalence, for it's our everyday ability to still be outraged, to have empathy, grief, and shock that allows us to grasp at our humanity, even when it seems that there is none to be had. Indeed, Fanon resigns because of the witnessing of what he calls a systematized dehumanization and on-the-ground conditions in Algeria as being, as he says, the logical consequence of an abortive attempt to decerebralize a people. The colonial subject under these deplorable, unacceptable, dehumanizing conditions we currently face are what Dunevskaya calls force and reason, and deepening and advancing anti-colonial struggle and movement. They, like Fanon, do not accept that nothing else can be done. And so my remarks will just focus a little bit on his Marxism and humanism, and then a little bit more on militancy to meet the moment. And I have more questions than I think I have proposals. So we can think of Fanon as a philosopher of racial capitalism with a particular focus on colonial social relations, a true dialectician, and someone who understood that when it comes to colonialism, the Marxian analysis must be stretched to deal with colonial context. A quote, "In the colonies, the economic substructure is also a superstructure. The cause is the consequence. You're rich because you're white because you're rich." And this is why Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched every time we have to do the colonial problem, as he says in Wretched of the Earth. Towards this end, Fanon has important thoughts on the question of psychoaffective dimensions of domination, the reactionary role of the national bourgeoisie, national consciousness over crude nationalisms, and an enduring commitment to colonized folks. Fanon frames anti-colonial struggle as a dialectical relationship between collective and individual self-determination, or as the anti-colonial scholar Abu Mane writes, he says, he advanced the notion that a real and authentic decolonization would have to result in the emancipation of the individual. We find this in places like Fanon's Toward the African Revolution, where he writes, the liberation of the individual does not follow national liberation. An authentic liberation exists only to the precise degree to which the individual has irreversibly began his liberation. For Fanon, I will argue his socialism is his revolutionary humanism. They're not separate political, philosophical, or practical projects. They are the same thing. I'll start this section on militancy to meet the statement from Dunevskaya, who, for her, without a philosophy of revolution, activism spends itself in mere anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism without ever revealing what it is for. And so we're here because Fanon remains really relevant for our current day struggles. And I'm just going to suggest 3 kind of areas that we can think about. Our support for anti-imperial projects across the globe, elevating the movement and the politics that undergird it, has to be about that over individual saviors. The question is how to dismantle a client state and to build people-centered anti-capitalist alternatives under current fascistic conditions. If nationalism is not explained, enriched, and deepened, if it does not very quickly turn into a social and political consciousness, into humanism, then it leads to a dead end, for Fanon. As a dialectician, Fanon understands that every stage of development relies on the very thing that it is critiquing, therefore bears contradictions that have to be overcome in the next stage. With Fanon, the struggle for national consciousness possibly, and we see examples of this, resulting in oppressive bourgeois nationalisms. We need to study and support peoples in and study with and support peoples in anti-colonial struggle with understanding the pitfalls, especially as new states and formations become even more targets of new imperialisms as the Western world loses a hold on it. And I'm thinking of all of the new configurations like places in Africa. In Wretched of the Earth, decolonize means creating new people with an entirely new mindset, one suited to freedom rather than submission. And with this, I think the understanding is that that struggles must be fought in psychoaffective, from that dimension, the psychoaffective dimension, that allows folks to overcome the inferiority complex that Fanon describes ever so well, and the passivity, and also experiment with next steps. The second thing I'm going to suggest is that the role of the revolutionary organization, along with its tasks, should be to work out the philosophy of the organization. And so the idea is that we should collaborate with other groups in this quest. What would a transition to a human-centered, a more planet-centered socialism look like? With arrangements, parties, political groupings, what do we need to build? And what will the structures of these political groupings look like? And what lessons will we take from unfinished revolutions and some of what Fanon describes so well in his work. Here I draw a little bit from philosopher and
Do you hear
Africanist
anything now? No.
Achille Bembe, who's called for what he calls
I can see the
planetary
blue thing
consciousness to address planetarization, which for him is a totalizing aspect of capital that includes new and endless development of digital ecosystems, making up what he calls platform capitalism. And he asks, to what extent can we rely on these infrastructures as part of the Earth become inhospitable to life in the near future? To this, he suggests something in alignment with Fanon, saying that the nation's trying to connect the nation state to kind of the individual. And he pulls on what's called the principle of subsidiarity. And where for him and others who are kind of thinking about these concepts, think about the activities that people do locally, with the nation state kind of posed in the middle, but configured in such a way to allow for planetary issues to be addressed planetarily and for local issues to be resolved where they take the most dramatic form. So here I'm reminded of the importance of some of the things I described at the beginning of my talk, getting to know one's neighbors, local involvement in the hyper kind of local movement making, like such as community self-defense against ICE, local tenant union, school board organizing, and I'm going to suggest that these are important for revolutionary organizations, and they are actually important for us in deepening and understanding our own internationalism, and that we can do those things without, especially from a very Western US-centered perspective, without being elitist. Finally, I'll end with saying things I've suggested before, that is, we need to move beyond representational identity politics or class first perspectives that don't reckon with the particularity of racialization under the capitalist domination. I also raise this issue because of tendencies to treat the issue of decolonizations or expressions like those found in some of the movements that we see in a way that class is either completely ignored or class is the only thing that is very much paid attention. For Fanon, racism and colonial subjugation must be fought both materially and psychically, since epidermalization is experienced both psychically and economically. And he says that genuine disalienation will be achieved when things in the material sense have resumed their rightful place. The caution here, though, is that not every movement of, or not every aspect of kind of a race first movement is progressive. And Fanon warns folks at the time of the Negritude movement of the potential for race essentialism or even elitism if expressions and things are addressed outside of material questions. And so what I've argued elsewhere is that these politics sometimes overshadow the project of dismantling capitalism and overcoming other systems of domination. And in fact, I always argue that they live quite comfortably and in fact thrive within the neoliberal order, particularly if groups are only seeking recognition and limiting their demands to matters of culture, inclusion, representation, or aesthetics. And I think that this warning is relevant to some of our movements captured in non-profiteering or platform capitalism. I'll end with saying that we live in worlds where the project of anti-colonialism lays unfinished. Fanon's emancipatory humanism, his concept of the new human, new society, suggests that we need to place less value on predetermined political programs and more on human subjects and their ability to theoretically and practically work out their problems. Dunevskaya's work also becomes very important here, not only because she recognizes Fanon's revolutionary humanisms and his anti-racist, anti-colonial philosophy, but also because she takes the activities of the masses seriously and does not rely solely on intellectuals' positions. Our tasks as revolutionaries, then, is to project better alternatives that take the everyday material conditions of folks seriously and to recognize, as Dunevskaya says, that there's a movement from practice, from the actual struggles of the day to theory, and second, to work out the method whereby the movement from theory can meet it. And so as I understanding, we are reaching beyond the politics of recognition, beyond the politics of redistribution of resources, beyond colonizers leaving the land, and for total emancipation that cannot be achieved without a concerted, anti-imperial, people-centered, life-affirming struggle, overcoming the false pretext that there's nothing else that can be done. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ndindi. I didn't have to be ferocious, so I really appreciate that. Peter, I'm going to invite you to start.
Well, hello, comrades. As I see it, there are four basic reasons that strike me that Fanon's new humanism matters now more than ever. First, it matters because his new humanism provides us with a vision of an alternative to dehumanization. And who can deny the dehumanization that is now engulfing us when Israel continues to bombard, starve, and murder hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in full view of the world, while the major powers do nothing to stop it? Not the Europeans, with their illusory talk of a two-state solution, nor the Chinese, whose trade with Israel last year topped $19 billion, and certainly not the US, where Trump, in alliance with corporate Democrats, are allowing Netanyahu to do whatever he wants. And who can deny such dehumanization as huge numbers of immigrants in the US are deported to concentration camps inside and outside the country, when science, healthcare, and disease prevention is gutted for the sake of fattening the pockets of billionaires, when freedom of speech, association, and thought is squashed, and when even modest efforts to limit climate change and destruction of native habitats is reversed. These crimes are hardly restricted, of course, to the West. They define non-Western powers as well, as shown by that spectacle a few weeks ago, where China's Xi Jinping declared, and I'm quoting him, "Today humanity is again faced with the choice of peace or war," end quote, as he stood shoulder to shoulder in Tiananmen Square with the butcher of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin, and his murderous ally, Kim Jong-un of North Korea. Fanon faced a very different set of realities, of course, than we do, but he speaks to us because of his response to one of the most egregious forms of dehumanization known to man, racialized colonial domination. We can learn much from how he rejected a vision of human possibility and freedom, even when facing seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Second, Fanon's new humanism matters because it was inseparable from a universal vision of emancipation. It's become a mantra in some circles that deride the very concept of universalism as if it necessarily implicates one in Western imperialist episteme. To be sure, there are innumerable examples of bourgeois society imposing its prerogatives upon colonized peoples and others by proclaiming their universality. But in doing so, they are absolutizing particularism. Fanon addressed this when he wrote, and I quote, "For if equality among men is proclaimed in the name of intelligence and philosophy, it is also true that these concepts have been used to justify the extermination of humanity," end quote. But he did not conflate the abstract universalism of bourgeois humanism with the concrete universalism of dialectical thought, which embraces a wealth of particulars. As he put it, we believe that an individual must endeavor to assume the universalism inherent in the human condition. Fanon, of course, acted and wrote from the standpoint of his particular experience as a Black man subjected to racial and colonial oppression in Martinique, France, and Algeria. Yet he did not consider his lived experience an interior realm that others are barred from accessing. In contrast to the view that it's not possible to grasp the experience of others unless one directly shares in them, he writes, again quoting in Black Skin, White Masks, "I sincerely believe that a subjective experience can be understood by all, and I dislike having to say that the Black problem is my problem and mine alone. Is there any difference between one racism and another? Don't we encounter the same downfall, the same failure of man," end quote. Fanon's embrace of concrete as against abstract universalism is integral, I think, to his entire project. This is how he can argue that, as he puts it, Black consciousness claims to be an absolute density full of itself, at the same time as insisting, in the absolute, the Black is no more to be loved than the check for what is to be done is truly to set humanity free. This perspective, I think, is especially timely since we inhabit a world of divided subjectivities. It's reflected in the attitude of those who condemn various atrocities committed around the world, but refrain from opposing those committed by US imperialism and its allies. Equally wrong-headed are those who refrain from denouncing reactionary state powers simply because they may oppose the US, as reflected, for instance, in those who refuse to support Ukraine's fight against Russia's neocolonial invasion, as if Ukrainians are not worthy of national self-determination. Occupation is a crime wherever it occurs, be it Palestine or Ukraine, Kashmir or Western Sahara, Puerto Rico or Eastern Turkestan. The tendency to oppose some variants of capitalism and imperialism while tailing others has a long and troubled history. Those who claim that Marxism is a Western ideology that was alien to those suffering from colonial oppression in Asia, Africa, and Latin America actually don't show much understanding of what was happening in the world during Fanon's lifetime. Tens of millions in the global South from the 1920s through the 1970s embraced some variant of Marxism or socialism in imposing Western capitalism imperialism. The problem was the variant of Marxism that most tended to embrace. It wasn't socialist humanism. It was variants of Marxist-Leninism and Stalinism, supporting or tail-ending state capitalist regimes that called themselves communist, whether in Europe or the Third World, led to one series of aborted and unfinished revolutions after another. This may seem to be ancient history, but it's not. It's a recurrent problem, though it takes new forms with each generation. And we see signs of it all around us today in the resurgence of Stalinist tendencies and some authoritarian tendencies in parts of today's left. It's not possible to develop a viable alternative to capitalism by accommodating, as I see it, accommodating oneself to one or another form of neocolonial domination while opposing others. And Fanon addressed this directly when he says, again in Black Skin, White Masks, quote, "If the question once arose for me about showing solidarity with a given past, it was because I was committed to myself and my fellow man to fight with all my life and all my strength so that never again would any people be enslaved on this earth," end quote. Now, the third reason I think that Fanon's New Humanism matters for today is because, as Ndindi was suggesting, it addresses the thorny problem of the relationship between race and class. Fanon argues that white racism produces a radical change in the dynamics of domination. Workers are exploited not only in being denied their product of labor, but in being alienated from their very activity of laboring. Nevertheless, the act of freely selling one's labor power provides the appearance of formal equality. To be sure, this equality is largely fictitious, but it provides the worker with at least a modicum of recognition. But matters are different when the additive of color defines class relations. Since white society views blacks as inherently inferior due to their epidermal appearance, their labor does not provide them with recognition. That's why black lives seem not to matter. Their humanity becomes invisible to the white gaze, or as Fanon put it, the black subject inhabits a zone of non-being. Two forms of domination, each with a class dimension, is at issue, but of radically different kinds. In the Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon takes issue with Jean-Paul Sartre's comment that race does not intersect with class, since race is supposedly concrete and particular, whereas class is universal. Sartre calls black consciousness a weak term of the dialectic that ultimately gives way to the proletarian class struggle. Deeply offended, Fanon responds that black consciousness is immanent in itself. I am not a potentiality of something, I am fully what I am. This is not a concession to narrow nationalism or racial essentialism. Rather, it's an affirmation that struggles against racism challenge the dehumanization that defines existing society. He makes this clear in writing, quote, Sartre forgets that the black man suffers in his body differently from the white man, end quote. That's not just a critique of Sartre, I think. It's a critique of all variants of radical thinking, Marxism included, that fails to grasp the specific dynamics of racial oppression. It seems to me that this is why, maybe perhaps why Fanon never identified with any tendency of Marxism, even though he was clearly influenced by Marx and various Marxists. The post-Marx Marxists of his time were class-centric, which stood in the way of grasping that blacks are not only exploited, but ontologically excluded from what established society considers human. Whereas the class struggle is about recovering the capacity to engage in freely associated labor, the anti-racist struggle is about recovering the capacity to be recognized for one's humanity. Fanon understood that revolutionary transformation centers on challenging the very fabric of human relations, the way we see, behave, and relate to each other. Along such lines, what Dunayevskaya once wrote, quoting her from Marxism and Freedom, that Marx's analysis of labor, she says, goes much further than the economic structure of society. His analysis goes to the actual human relations, end quote. Likewise, we can say that Fanon's critique of racism goes much further than a demand to be recognized by existing power structures. His analysis likewise goes to the actual human relations. It's in this sense that while Fanon had to stretch Marx to deal with the realities of the colonial situation, his writings may provide a lens for grasping the much neglected humanism of Marxism. For Marx surely focused on class domination because he viewed it as the foremost barrier to the realization of human capacities. But surely the denial of humanity's species capacities applies to other forms of oppression as well. That's why in his early writings, he refers to the treatment of women as the measure of how free or unfree any society is, and why his late writings extend beyond the purview of the Western working class by focusing on the peasantry and oppressed nationalities in the non-Western world. We'll have a panel that deals with that shortly. In Fanon's case, the necessity to make sense of his lived experiences compelled him not to limit his critique to class domination. But this did not entail leaving aside class, as is often the case with many today. It's shown by his work as a practicing psychiatrist, who extended care to those subjected to the neuroses generated by a racialized society. This was no mere professional adjunct to an otherwise political career. It rather informed it. As Nigel Gibson points out in his new book, Combat Breathing, Fanon's innovation is to argue that a psychoanalytic approach is necessary to understand Black alienation, while emphasizing the centrality of a socio-diagnostic approach connected to fundamentally changing society. In a word, he held Fanon that racism could not be effectively combated through cultural self-expression or personal advancement within existing power structures. And that's a point worth thinking about for today, given the ongoing debates over race and class. The fourth reason I think Fanon's New Humanism matters is that it speaks to a new generation seeking to renew a socialist alternative after decades of its eclipse. This is addressed in Wretched of the Earth's effort to envision, his last work, to envision how anti-colonial movements could transition from national liberation to social revolution. He knew the new humanism he aspired for could not be sustained short of a socialist society. But how is that to be achieved, and what kind of socialism did he have in mind? Very briefly, Fanon insists that the newly independent states must become thoroughly democratic, with the masses having direct input in administrating the state, with the freedom to meet, discuss, express themselves, and innovate. He held that the political leadership must elevate the minds of the masses through educational initiatives that encourage them to explore theoretical issues and think for themselves. He argued that women must be given equal importance to men, not in the articles of the Constitution, but in daily life, in the factory, in schools, and in assemblies. And he held the economy should be thoroughly decentralized. While some nationalization of industry may be needed, he insists, and I quote, "It must not take on the aspect of rigid state control. Decentralized cooperatives should dominate that involve the masses in economic management." And he not only called for a fair redistribution of the products of labor, but emphasized the need to transform the labor process itself. Writing in one of his last psychiatric writings, labor must be recovered as the humanization of humanity. Humanity, when it throws itself into work, fecundates nature, but it fecundates itself as well. So much for the claim that Fanon ignored class relations, which you hear an awful lot. Most of all, Fanon opposed single-party states. Although he supported a single united front of parties, such as Algeria's Front for National Liberation, in leading the struggle for independence, he viewed it as a danger after the seizure of power, declaring in his last work, "The single party is the modern form of the bourgeois dictatorship, stripped of mask, makeup, and scruples, cynical in every respect. Sooner or later," he says, "the party, as he puts it, skips the parliamentary phase and chooses a national socialist-type dictatorship," end quote. In the last months of his life, Fanon worried that the African revolutions would fall short of these principles and regress towards new forms of domination. Nevertheless, he remained hopeful that with Algeria leading the way, the African revolutions could surpass the bourgeois phase and transition to a democratic socialist society. He was mistaken in this belief, though it was understandable given the creative energies unleashed by the masses during the struggles for national independence. Not long after gaining power, the leaders of the new states either accommodated to new colonialism or became repressive single-party states that failed to remain grounded in the masses. This was true of even his closest allies, such as Algeria's FLN and the regimes in Ghana and Guinea, who were certainly much more progressive than others. Nor was this true only in Africa. By the 1980s, the revolutions in Asia, Africa, and Latin America had largely failed to escape the confines of either private or state capitalism. Fanon's warning that struggles for national liberation could regress if they did not actualize a new humanism surely proved prophetic. It's a warning for us today as well, as a new generation seeks to reconstruct a socialist alternative in the face of a new barbarism. There is no assurance that we will avoid the kinds of wrong turns taken in the past. After all, Marxism does not have a good record of living up to Marxist humanism, and post-colonial theory has not done a great job living up to Fanon's new humanism. But with Fanon as our guide, and by internalizing the lessons of both history past and in the making, we can, I think, obtain some important direction for meeting our problems today.
Thank you, Peter. Excellent. We're doing very well on time, but the content is particularly excellent so far. Thank you, everyone. Alex, we are going to post a link to your paper, and I'm going to invite you to take the center stage.
Thank you. So the title of my talk is The Weapon of Science, Frantz Fanon and the Decolonial Disalienation of Queer, Trans, and Intersex Life. So while Fanon did not develop a comprehensive theoretical system for studying sex and sexuality, I argue that his anti-colonial praxis lends itself to such developments, in spite of his personal shortcomings with respect to misogyny and homophobia. I will contextualize Fanon's infamous comments on homosexuality and offer a reparative analysis that applies his humanist critique of alienation, sociogenic method, and innovative approaches to science and psychiatry to contemporary queer, trans, and intersex struggles. Many have written about the infamous footnote in Black Skin's White Masks that asserts that there are no homosexuals in Martinique. While a critic of many reactionary elements within the discipline of psychology, Fanon remained largely on the same page as those who saw homosexuality as a product of pathology. Fanon follows this remark with an account of the Martinicians he knew as only becoming homosexuals after going to Europe. In these cases, he attributes their behavior to the economic necessity of sex work rather than the presence of neurotic pathology in homosexuals. Fanon's sociogenic method led him to challenge accounts of sex and sexuality that reduced them to ahistorical individual family relations, untouched by the realities of capitalist imperialism and colonialism. But unfortunately, this didn't immediately lead him to a more radical conclusion. Queer Cuban philosopher José Esteban Muñoz famously develops the concept disidentification through his study of Fanon's infamous footnote by taking it within the broader significance of his anti-colonial praxis. Muñoz reads Fanon's comments as an argument that to be homosexual, queer, transgender is a white thing, and he pairs this framing of queerness or transness with whiteness alongside the reality that the majority of the representations of queer and trans life have been white. Between these two claims, he posits another figure, the queer revolutionary from the Antilles, perhaps a young woman who has already been burned in Fanon's texts by his writing on the colonized women. Muñoz has us ponder, quote, what process can keep an identification with Fanon, his politics, his work possible for this woman? In such a case, a disidentification with Fanon might be one of the only ways in which she's capable of reformatting the powerful theorist for her own project, one that might be as queer and feminist as it is anti-colonial. Disidentification offers a Fanon for that queer and lesbian reader who would not be sanitized. Instead, his homophobia and misogyny would be interrogated while his anti-colonial discourse was engaged as a still valuable yet mediated identification. Unquote. While I do not excuse Fanon's homophobic comments, I want to contextualize what homosexual could have meant to him, given his historical and geographical context, as it was given meaning within the French left. In a 1964 interview with Playboy magazine, gay activist and writer Jean Genet would say, quote, perhaps if I hadn't gone to bed with Algerians, I might not have been in favor of the FLN. That's not so. I probably would have sided with them anyway. But perhaps it was homosexuality that made me realize Algerians are no different from other men. Unquote. Even from the perspective of a white French gay man, the categories of homosexual and Algerian were mutually exclusive. And the horizon of anti-colonial revolutionary possibility for white gays is partially made possible through the erotic fetish of racialized men, a dubious line of argument that would also seem to imply that heterosexual men should become feminist revolutionaries because of their sex with women. A far-right French publication would claim that, quote, after the liberation in 1945, the mass arrival of North Africans encouraged this upsurge of homosexuality. Against this, white gay leftists doubled down on being gay for Algerians, as they saw this as a revolutionary counter to the far-right Oriental myths of Arabs as feminine, bringing pernicious homosexuality. While white French gay leftists attempted to invert the stereotype by fetishizing the anti-colonial Arab male fighter as the apex of masculinity, for whom they would bottom for in an act of revolutionary solidarity. While they sought to flip the scripts, they did so in a way that did not undermine the Orientalism and the far right, and instead perpetuated the colonial Manichaeanism of homosexual versus Algerian. In a reversal of what Fanon diagnoses in Black Skin, White Masks as the pathology of interracial sexual relations, where Black men come to desire white women on the ill-fated hope of becoming white, and publications from the Homosexual Front for Revolutionary Action, or FAR, white gays sought to become revolutionary and Arab through sexual encounters with Algerians. The politics of FAR culminated in a sexualizing of politics, imbuing specific sexual acts and positions with inherent political content. To see race shifting on the white gay left alongside a recapitulation of a fundamental difference between gays and Arabs, even if that difference is valorized, should not surprise us given Fanon's diagnoses of the colonial condition. This approach left little space for the self-determination of colonized, sexually marginalized, and/or gender-variant people. In their analysis of what homosexual liberation looked like, the colonized remained a tool of the colonizers, a tool for sexual encounters to transform them into politically revolutionary subjects. Homosexual taken within this content renders Fanon's comments on there being no homosexuals in Martinique true in the sense of Marie Lugone's analysis of the coloniality of gender. She writes, quote, "The semantic consequence of the coloniality of gender is that colonized woman is an empty category. No women are colonized, no colonized females are women," unquote. The categories of sexuality given by the concept of homosexual as deployed by the white French gay left was not a rupture from the coloniality of gender. Essentialism in every form remains an enemy of revolutionary decolonial politics as it leaves in place the fundamental forms of alienation of the colonial condition. In the process of developing his sociogenic method in psychology, Fanon was decolonizing psychoanalysis and the burgeoning practice of social institutional therapy as he learned it from the Catalonian resistance fighter François Tosquelles. Fanon sought out Tosquelles after he learned about his successful prevention of the eugenic extermination of patients at St. Alban during the Vichy regime. As a Marxist, Tosquelles knew that mental health issues were not solvable nor created by an individual, but rather they were the product of an alienated social existence. Given this analysis, he wanted to create a mini-society within the hospital that could offer a social and humanized way of life as a reprieve from the outside world. The hospital would serve as a prefigurative space, turning into a healing collective. Fanon's time at St. Alban was transformative in the development of his new approach to mental health and the organization of hospitals. But when he tried to replicate this model after going to Algeria, it did not have the same effectiveness. The problem was that one cannot neutrally shape the social space of the hospital. Culture is inevitably part of social life. In the colonial situation, the doctor's role is in fact to assimilate colonized patients so that they are docile in the face of daily violence. Eventually, Fanon would come to the conclusion that disalienation of Algerian patients would only become possible after Algeria liberated itself from colonial rule. Fanon's decolonization of Tosquelles' institutional therapy is a critical site for consideration as we think about what still must be decolonized and transformed within science with respect to trans and intersex issues. For example, the enforcement of genital mutilation of intersex babies to fit a standard of embodiment seen as critical for a cisgender heterosexual future is another form of doctors assimilating patients into particular colonial and capitalist cultural norms. Under our current conditions, doctors are structurally used to civilize unruly embodiments that challenge the norms of gender life. Fanon fought back against the demand to acclimate and medicate his patients to more easily assimilate them under dehumanizing conditions. Similarly, intersex people have fought against the medicalization of their existence for either assimilation or elimination. The dialectics of both criticizing the medicalization and pathologization of trans and intersex life, while also demanding access to medical care, is a structure that has roots in Fanon's dialectical decolonial approach to medicine, especially through his documentation of the democratizing access to care and scientific knowledge in the process of the national liberation struggle. In the case of gender affirmative care, the medical industry did not invent it and should not be allowed to gatekeep it. While there's widespread narratives that trans liberation is contingent on medical institutionalization, this flies in the face of trans history, which has mostly operated outside of medical institutions. Doctors have been used to criminalize, pathologize, and gatekeep trans life, or trans people have created the means of their lives and did so outside the reach of medical institutions. What has come to be known as trans DIY is not a new phenomena, but rather is a historical norm. DIY embodies the aspiration for gender autonomy and self-determination, As Jules Gill-Peterson writes, quote, DIY has envisioned freedom in starkly different terms. Instead of pathologizing people to grant them access to medical resources or relying on the state's flimsy blessing, activists imagine community-run clinics where people to whom transition matters most would support one another and distribute the care they needed. Trans DIY can be read as an example of the weapon of science, which I name in the spirit of Cabral, and should be seen as a tool of decolonial struggle. In his essay, Medicine and Colonialism, Fanon outlines what he calls, quote, the most tragic features of the colonial condition, which is the imposed scientific underdevelopment of the colonized, producing an ambiguous relationship to scientific inquiry. As Fanon writes, quote, the colonized perceives the doctor, the engineer, the school teacher, the policeman, the rural constable through a haze of an almost organic confusion. The mistrust of doctors and medicine is not irrational, as racist scientists might frame it, as if it were the product of a dichotomy of science versus superstition. There exists an unbridgeable chasm of truth for the colonizer and truth for the colonized, which undermines the project of science and cannot be overcome except in the midst of revolution. Fanon then outlines the changing relationship of the colonized to medicine and science as doctors either move with or against them in the revolutionary activity. Once the French authorities make certain forms of medical care and medicines like antibiotics and vaccines illegal, suddenly these look like valuable tools and not perniciously colonial. Some European doctors defect from their assigned roles, sneaking supplies to the revolutionaries, while many native doctors join the liberation struggle and are reclaimed by their community. This process forged trust and the appropriation of science in the service of liberation and self-determination on the terms of Algerians. While not in the same situation of revolutionary upheaval, there's been an emerging critical reappropriation of science and medicine with respect to sex, gender, and sexuality, despite the origins of many medical treatments having roots in eugenic, sexist, and racist medical exploitation. As Fanon witnessed serious differences in outcomes for European women and Algerian men at Blida Joinville Hospital, he developed critiques of the concepts of madness and normalcy, where medical professionals were supposed to cure madness and assimilate patients into alignment with the sick world. In a similar line of thinking, trans of color theorists have raised the concept of colonial dysphoria to name this experience when it comes to gender. As Omi Salas Santa Cruz writes, quote, in the framework of Western medicine, while gender dysphoria is typically understood as an increase in dissidence related to gender and bodies, for transgender people of color, the dissonance extends beyond these aspects. The colonial gender system exacerbates dissidence around body materiality, the borders of what constitutes a trans body identity, and what constitutes trans knowledge, complicating their experiences in ways that go beyond traditional understandings of gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is a form of alienation that is not experienced in culturally neutral ways. It too is formed by the colonial color line. To ally the ontological alienation experienced by those who inhabit what Fanon called the zone of non-being is to misunderstand the strategies and techniques of power and domination that make our world so deadly and destructive. To experience gender dysphoria requires one to begin from a place of not feeling at home in one's social and political existence and embodiment. This may be the product of not fitting in with the Euro-modern constructions of cisgendered heteronormativity, or it could be from the colonial imposition of gendered life in general. Colonial dysphoria cannot be resolved by engaging in gender affirmative care. It can only be resolved with the abolition of colonial relations and the alienated social relations of racial capitalism. Modes of transgender life descendant from the coloniality of gender are visible in the ways that some trans individuals and organizations have sought to distance themselves from perversion, disability, mental illness, and anything associated with abnormality. La Damnée de la Terre cannot simply lay hold of ready-made colonial scientific and medical machinery and wield it for its own purposes. The weapon of science must be transformed in a revolutionary process towards disalienation through the abolition of the colonial order of things. And this has no less to do with the colonial orders of sex and gender. The struggles of the FLN to reappropriate scientific knowledge for the national liberation struggle and what has come to be known as trans DIY are both examples of revolutionary uses of the weapons of science towards disalienation of the oppressed. While these conclusions were not drawn out by Fanon, his anti-colonial praxis opens onto pathways towards the disalienation and self-determination of all forms of sexual and gender variant life on both sides of the color line. That's all I got.
Wonderful. That's a lot. Thank you. Well, everybody's being very kind to me today. So I am going to call on, sorry, I can't see everyone and do the moderation, but Annie, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm just gonna switch on my timer, sorry. So I want to start by pointing out for this moment, it's important to remind ourselves that the death of an empire is as sure as the death of man, and we are living through the dying spasms of another empire. We see it in the convulsions of our politics, in the rise of ethno-nationalism, the frantic clinging to old hierarchies. We feel it in the pervasive sense of anxiety, the crumbling of old certainties, and the violent backlash against demands for a more just world. And in this moment, the center, which has been the kind of center of gravity for politics in the West for decades now, neoliberalism, it's become clear that that center can no longer hold. The myths are failing, and the rules-based international order that we were promised, which was to create a society which apparently was more just, underpinned by ambitious demands for sustainable development, is coming undone. We're failing even on that front against every metric. So in that moment, why must we then return to Fanon? And I think it's not because he's a relic of a kind of old colonial era. I think it's because many people are waking up today to the reality that the colonial era that Fanon spoke to did not disappear, it just reconfigured itself, right? And it's also precisely because we're moving or living in an era with many similarities, but also many differences, which feels as though it's unraveling in just the way that his did. In the 1960s, in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, the left felt that we were going to win, that we were on the eve of revolution, that capitalism was coming undone and the world was going to be transformed. But today we live in an era where it's very clear that the system that we're operating in is coming undone, that system is decaying, but it's not as clear. We don't have that same sense for this moment that we're on the front foot, and that we might, in the terms of Sivanandan, a brilliant scholar from Britain, catch the wing of history such that we might be able to determine the course of our own destinies. And so now we're confronted with a choice. Do we descend into the chaos of competing tribalisms? And in this talk, I want to speak to the West in some sense, but I also want to speak to a context, Nigeria, which I'm also deeply kind of embedded in at the moment intellectually. Or do we struggle instead for a new way of being human altogether? And I think that struggle is precisely what animates Fanon's work. And I want to kind of frame it in terms of a unlikely contradiction. So typically we speak of reform versus revolution, but today I want to speak of resistance versus revolution. What are those two different frames, and what does that mean? So in this kind of milieu or maelstrom, Fanon doesn't offer us any easy answers. He offers us something that's far more valuable, a means by which to diagnose the disease, and also importantly, a prescription for a cure. And that prescription isn't a program of politics, isn't a manner of structuring society, but rather an orientation that we can all hold fast to in the way that we organize in our own circles or in our own context, and also in the way that we connect our own context to the international context. I think he offers us a radical and a demanding and truly universal. Peter spoke about how, you had the false universalism of a bourgeois society, which imposes from above, from the abstract, a notion of universal categories that apply to all of us, which in material reality don't apply. And Fanon offers the reverse, which is to say, to construct a society which begins from the point of the material in order to conceive of ourselves in how we practice and our cultures of resistance and revolution, a universal sense of the human. And I think in order to understand how this imperial decline is manifesting, not just out there in the world that we hear about in the news, but also right here at home, I think it's important to take a sharper lens. We need to look at how a system in crisis manages its internal contradictions, and how those it treats or manages those who it renders disposable. And I think that offers us a window into the title of today's symposium, this notion of fascism. And much has been said in recent years about the resurgence of fascism, about the return of fascism, about Trump being fascist. And I want to offer from the Black radical tradition an alternative kind of viewpoint on what fascism is. I'm borrowing here from George Jackson, but the notion that fascism, instead of being an ideology that is adopted by people of the far right, is a system of control of population management in which society or technology of the state, which allows for that state to manage surplus populations. And I think this really cuts to the heart of what the question of what the human is. So if bourgeois society offers us a universal definition of the human, then the people to whom those freedoms, to whom those that quality of life, to whom that manner of engaging society is not available, they become the borders of humanity. And I think we're living through a fraying of those borders, not just on the part of populations who we historically or typically would view as minorities or marginalized, but that actually the scale of the violent backlash that we're seeing in this moment is a consequence of the fact that the fraying of the boundary of human is entered into sections of the population which we typically would view as privileged, right? So in capitalism, in this late stage of capitalism, what we see is that financialization on the one hand has produced a profound deviation or split between the language and the data points that we use to define whether or not an economy is doing well on the one hand, and the actual lived experience. Across the West, we talk about a cost of living crisis, right? At the same time, the rise of automation, outsourcing, deindustrialization in the imperial core has meant that the labor required to continue the accumulation of profit has become ever smaller in relation to the population. And so as a consequence of that, the surplus population, which we historically would think about as minority groups, has increasingly become white rural workers, has increasingly become those left behind in rural parts of Britain as a consequence of the decline of mining or manufacturing. And this has found, the right has found a language with which to present this, that language being an anti-immigrant politic, but also, especially with this new Trump administration around the question of trade, the politics of how we make our things or of manufacturing. But on the other hand, the question of what to actually do with this surplus seems to have fallen by the wayside, right? So they offer you all the diagnoses of what the problem is, and that problem is always outside of us because we have to maintain the integrity of the concept of the nation or to which we pledge loyalty. But no one seems to be offering an actually alternative view of what do we do with this population? How do we reconstruct the nation in such a way that it's capacious enough to hold all of us? I remember earlier in the summer, I gave a talk at a conference with Peter and other conferences. I spoke about how, well, there was a bit of a debate about the question of nationalism. And I think one of the challenges for the left, and I think Fanon offers us huge insight into this question, is that we've completely left the question of the nation or contesting the terms of the nation to the right and rejected the concept of nationalism or national liberation or national culture entirely. Okay, so enter Fanon here. So in terms of the antidote, I think what he reminds us is that liberation does begin with a refusal, right, of the notion that to not be productive, to not contribute to the accumulation of capital renders us surplus or renders us extraneous. But I think more importantly, what he offers us is an alternative means to through which to understand the category of human, where he talks about how mankind or man is a yes, it's an affirmative, it's a positive vision, rather than a scale of productivity. So if we think about how this manifests itself, we think about how in terms of the technologies of the state, the carceral state, in terms of policing, in terms of algorithmic order. I think one of the key differences between our moment and Fanon's moment is not that our moment has a difference of quality, but rather that the scale and the efficiency through which the state can manage populations, through which the state metes out violence, is at a scale that couldn't have been imagined at that time. I think it's furthermore important to kind of note that, there was an inverse relationship, between the degree of violence, which is necessary to hold together an imperial order, and the degree of stability that that order has. So I think that it's important for us to remind ourselves, just as Fanon reminded us, that these spasms of violence are a reflection that there is an opening or an opportunity available to us to transform the conditions under which we live. So next I want to kind of move to this distinction that I drew between resistance and revolution. And I think when Fanon says that man is a yes, that is to articulate the revolutionary frame of thinking. And I want to kind of, in this section, talk about how in his chapter on the national culture and on the pitfalls of national consciousness, what we get is an understanding of the anti-colonial movements, or the movements of national liberation, as operating simultaneously in both frames. To recover land and to recapture land, to kick out colonizers, is a frame of resistance. But his argument is that that is not sufficient. It's not sufficient to say we don't like what's happening to us. It's not sufficient to say we oppose deportations. It's not sufficient to say that we oppose the carceral state. What we have to do is offer an alternative. And I think that's the new humanism that Fanon brings to the table. So what would that look like today? I think a lot of us are having been on the back foot, first in the neoliberal kind of consensus, where you could change the party but never the policy, for the last 4 decades. I think a lot of us have gotten out of the frame of politics. And I think the series of crises that capitalism has encountered since 2008 has slowly brought the question of politics back into the frame, and has slowly offered the possibility that we might be able to resist. But I think because our resistance has been framed by crisis, that resistance has stayed in that frame. And we see that in the way that we organize, in the kind of prevalence of allyship politics over solidaristic politics, but also in the hollowness of our accounts of politics at the universal level. And in order to illuminate this, what I wanted to do was draw on a conversation that I had this week, where I turned in an article for my column. I write largely on the Nigerian economy and politics. I turned in an article on the Protestant ethic and the Confucian ethic. And the argument that I made was that in order to develop as a country, history shows us that the role of the state is not simply to invest in different sectors, but rather that the role of the state and the role of the national culture is to create the kind of subjects that can inhabit the world that we want to create, or create the kind of subjects that we can inhabit the country we want to create. And obviously it's a financial paper, so the conversation wasn't particularly pleasant. But I think it's important to remind ourselves of the power of Fanon's psychosocial account, right? Which is to say, the way that we think of ourselves and who we think is the we, or the kind of object of our sentence, subject of our sentence, has a profound impact on how we see the world as unfolding, and also what we think we need to do. And in the Nigerian context, as is the case in many of the new states that emerged after the collapse of the British Empire and French Empire, we have a growing problem of sectarianism, and in particular, a kind of increase in calls, or a growing swell of calls for cessation. And I find it interesting because as we talk about the rise of ethno-nationalism, oftentimes we kind of limit that to white identity politics in the West. But what we aren't thinking about is how the kind of moment of national liberation, which for a second allowed for groups of people from vastly different, so I'm going to wrap up very quickly, groups of people from vastly different cultures within the boundaries created by colonization to think of themselves as a nation within these arbitrary borders is beginning to dissipate, right? And so maybe in the questions we might be able to get to this. Sorry, I'm running out of time, but I think it's important now more than ever to take agency over the question of who the subject is and who the we is and who the universal is. And I think that has to be done from the ground up without the assumptions that we have that long history of anti-colonial struggle. I'll leave it there.
Thank